Welcome. Good morning. Welcome to CSIS. I'm Sara Allinder. I'm the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow here at the CSIS Global Health Policy Center. We're delighted to host Dr. David Nabarro here today to discuss his candidacy for Director General of the World Health Organization. Dr. Nabarro is one of the 6 official candidates for this post. The others are Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, the Ethiopian Minister of Foreign Affairs and former Minister of Health, Dr. Sanya Nishtar, the Pakistan Minister of Education and Training, Dr. Miklos Soska, the Hungarian former Minister of Health, Dr. Flavia Bustreo, the Italian Assistant Director General for Family, Women's, and Children's Health, and Dr. Philippe Douste-Blazy, the former French Minister of Health and founder of Unitaid, who was here last week on September 29th to discuss his candidacy. You can find the video of that online at csis.org. We hope to have the opportunity to host the other candidates over the next few months before the January scheduled WHO Executive Board meeting, where they will choose 3 of the candidates to send forward to the World Health Assembly, which will vote on approval in May. This Director General process is happening at a particularly exceptional time in global health, and in global affairs in general, with so many political and leadership changes occurring over the next few months. Beyond the U.S. administration change and turnover of key foreign policy, development, and health positions, UNICEF and the Global Fund will both experience leadership changes in the coming months. It also appears that Portugal's former Prime Minister Antonio Guterres is poised to become the next UN Secretary General, and Jim Kim recently won approval for a second term at the World Bank. These changes offer opportunities for the next WHO Director General to step in and provide strong leadership and direction on the priorities in global health. This election also occurs in the aftermath of Ebola, and against the backdrop of 6 major post-Ebola studies, all of which touched on the WHO and highlighted the need for a Director General with gravitas, who is a proven statesperson who can lead with diplomacy and mediate, as well as speak truth to power, while at the same time tackling some major challenges facing the organization, including its funding model and relationships with the private sector, and at the same time investing in internal reforms to modernize WHO's human resources and bring about greater transparency. The new WHO Director General also must be poised to address some major public health challenges, including preparedness against emerging threats in the wake of Ebola and now with Zika, health crises occurring as a result of natural disasters as well as political and military conflicts, the emergence of antimicrobial resistance as a recognized global threat, which was highlighted at UNGAS a few weeks ago, as well as the juxtaposition between innovation and affordable access, which was highlighted in the high-level panel's recent report on pricing and access, as well as the need for new research and development and innovation to battle ongoing public health threats such as HIV, malaria, tuberculosis, and non-communicable diseases. This is a huge lift, and we are very pleased that Dr. Nabarro is here today to tell us why he is best positioned to take on this role and address these challenges. Dr. Nabarro has already proven himself as a well-respected leader in addressing many of the most challenging global health threats of the last 30 years. He has extensive experience in public health, nutrition, and development at country, regional, and global levels, and has held positions in NGOs, universities, national government, and the United Nations system. Following stints in the United Kingdom Overseas Development Administration and the UK Department of International Development, Dr. Nabarro joined the UN system in 1999, leading the Rollback Malaria Initiative at the WHO. He was appointed as a WHO Executive Director in 2001 and led WHO's Department for Health Action and Crises from 2003. Dr. Nabarro serves as Special Advisor of the UN Secretary General on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Climate Change. He also oversees the Secretary General's special initiatives, including Every Mother, Every Child, Global Pulse, and Zero Hunger Challenge, and the UN Office for Partnerships. From September 2014 to December 2015, he was Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General on Ebola, providing strategic and policy direction for the international response. And last month, he was appointed to lead efforts to address the cholera crisis in Haiti. He has brought immense commitment to all of these endeavors and demonstrated tremendous ability to address challenging issues working across diverse stakeholders and within the UN system. He brings this extensive experience to his candidacy for the position of WHO Director General, and we look forward to his presentation. After we hear from them, we will transition to conversation and discussion with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I understand that we're on record and that we should, when we talk, press the button.
That's correct.
Even if we've got loud voices.
That's correct.
Thank you for sparing time to come here and spend this period in this conversation. I propose to talk for between 15 and 20 minutes and then to stop. I'm very happy actually to be interrupted if you feel that I've perhaps been imprecise, and I'll go back to where I was. So don't feel that you've got to hold back if while I'm talking you want to speak. Though I'm sure that it's best if I do stop on time and then we have the discussion. What I'm planning to do is to talk a little bit about my background and some of the activities in which I've been involved, often with several of you actually. And then I'd like to focus on the priorities that I would like to address when I'm in WHO. And then I'd like to discuss some of the features of WHO that Sara alluded to, the organization's role in the world and the challenges it has in fulfilling that role. And I want to give some thoughts to you as to things that I would seek to do as Director General to address those challenges. Just a bit about myself and the kind of person I am. I've been a health professional all my life. Really, before I became a physician, really before I'd become an adolescent, I was focused, partly because of where I was brought up and what the interests of my parents, focused on the way in which the determinants of health are not always inside the health sector or inside its institutions. They actually are spread right across society. And I think the early recognition of that led me, once I had qualified as a physician in the early 1970s, to decide not to accept the opportunity to stay inside the British hospital system for very long, but to work in different settings around the world, in northern Canada with the Grenfell Mission in Labrador, in North Iraq with the Kurds, working for Mullah Mustafa Barzani at the time when there was a Kurdish rebellion against the rest of the society in Iraq. And then in Nepal, in East Nepal, working in child health and being involved for initially a couple of years, and then it prolonged and became 5 years in a child health and development program, working with non-governmental organizations and the Nepalese government. And the experiences of those early roles have just stayed with me and guided me ever since. And they always reminded me, first of all, that extremely poor people, when they get sick, have very, very serious consequences from this illness. Secondly, that a lot of that sickness is due to the circumstances under which they live. And thirdly, that simply providing medical care is not actually going to deal with the continued threat of illness, and that we have to approach health in a much more holistic and whole of society way than just in the medical center or in the hospital. And so, drawing on that, I shifted from being a health practitioner to finding myself working in development. And for the next 15 years of my life was either involved in the links between development and health, or was actually a development practitioner. In India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan and Sri Lanka, in East Africa, in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and then in Latin America, particularly in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. I was able to function in a mix of roles, sometimes working in development projects and looking at their impact on health in East Nepal. Also, I was involved in developing strategies for health development for the British government and for international organizations, particularly in East Africa. And then, over time, I gradually gravitated into working in government, initially in the British Foreign Office and then in the British Department for International Development. And in that role became the Director for Human Development before, in 1999, applying to go to WHO when Gro Harlem Brundtland became the Director General. I was extremely excited by the energy that Dr. Brundtland offered to bring to WHO, to have a former serving Prime Minister with well-known skills coming into the organization after a period under a previous Director General that wasn't WHO's finest hour, was a real opportunity. And working with Dr. Brundtland, I was given the job of advancing her flagship program on malaria, called the Rollback Malaria Program. Did that for a period, and then Dr. Brundtland's Chief of Staff and the Director of her office left to go and serve a newly elected Prime Minister in Norway, and so I went and became Dr. Brundtland's Chief of Staff around the time when the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria was being set up, and we were also negotiating with pharmaceutical companies to reduce the cost of HIV AIDS treatment, particularly in poorer countries. After doing a number of jobs with Dr. Brundtland and then jobs under her successor, the late Dr. J.W. Lee, I was then sent to New York to work with Kofi Annan, because at that time we were seeing that avian influenza and the threat of a pandemic was more than a medical issue, it was a political issue. And Kofi Annan asked J.W. Lee to provide a person to work with him on the politics of pandemics, and I was given that role. Kofi Annan wanted Margaret Chan, but J.W. Lee said Margaret Chan's busy in Geneva, but he said you can have David Nabarro instead. And I then stayed working with Kofi Annan and then segued to working with Ban KiMoon on really preparing not just the United Nations but the world for the possibility that a major influenza pandemic could come along. And it taught me an awful lot about the challenges of preparing for a major outbreak in a world that really doesn't like investing in preparedness. Subsequently, Ban KiMoon decided that I was reasonably good at bringing together different parts of the United Nations and leading us into better ways of doing things. And I was asked to take on the job of coordinating the UN's work when food prices started rising rapidly in 2008. And the decision to put me into that role really reflected the fact that he felt, because he was getting positive signs from others, that I was able to get progress whilst at the same time coordinating in a way that did not lead to a lot of difficulty between the different barons that we have in running different parts of the UN system. And in that work, I must say that I learned a great deal about the importance of well-defined strategies and clear narratives around complex issues as ways to provide a framework within which there is leadership that enables everybody to come together and know their place in dealing with a complex problem. I'd learnt a lot about that on the influenza obligation, but I must say it was my work on food and food security, linking food policy and agriculture, linking food, agriculture and nutrition, and dealing with the impact of climate change, and then shaping up these relationships so that we were ready to develop new ideas for the Sustainable Development Goals was perhaps the biggest intellectual and operational challenge that I'd had up to that time. After I was focused primarily on food, then the Secretary General said, now could you take on nutrition? Nutrition's a really difficult issue. We've got a lot of dissent within our system on nutrition, and that dissent is clearly upsetting and perturbing governments around the world who want to address nutrition. They see it as a productivity and economic issue. And so we had to think of a formulation to deal with that nutrition challenge. And we proposed something completely new, what we've called subsequently the movement to scale up nutrition, very much with encouragement from the people working at national level to try to enable the responsibility for advancing nutrition to be pulled into countries and communities and not to be stuck in the international machinery. And that's been very successful. 58 countries plus 3 Indian states, big ones, are members of the movement, and they've been able, through establishing multi-stakeholder platforms at national level, to bring different stakeholders together and to work effectively. And of course, there are often challenges when you've got multi-stakeholder working about potential conflicts of interest, and those have to be dealt with very seriously. But it has been a really useful way, at least, of helping nutrition come from the battlegrounds that scarred it so much in the years leading up to 2010. In 2014, I was rather rapidly pulled off my nutrition work and asked to help Ban KiMoon with what he was seeing as a really major issue facing the whole UN system around the Ebola outbreak. He said to me, there is evidently a real problem about what's happening through our health agencies, yet at the same time, I don't think that we can crowd in other parts of the UN and also work with world leaders on this Ebola crisis without getting a much better strategic understanding of the issues. And he offered me the chance to become the strategist for the UN part of that operation, and gradually that meant building up a consortium and working strategically with an awful lot of other actors as well. And that was another opportunity to see the value of good strategic work when there are multiple stakeholders, potential tensions, and a need to deliver results quickly. I think that slowly, it took us more weeks than I would have liked, we were able to shift the whole style and tenor of the response so that it was both credible to the multiplicity of people at local, national, and international level that were involved, and so that it worked. And then that was finished at the end of 2015. I'm now doing a similar kind of operation with the Sustainable Development Goals, and also was involved in a similar operation with the effort to get the COP21 Paris Climate Agreement to come into force and to shift the discourse on climate and development. We're in the middle of that now. The thing came into force yesterday. We had amazing crowding in of countries ratifying the agreement. It's past the 55% of emissions threshold. Development will be completely different from now on. And mark my words, it's going to be an extremely interesting next few months. And then the other job that I was given most recently, similar issue, was cholera in Haiti, where we've got so many difficulties to deal with. And again, this big strategy approach has been asked of me by the Secretary General, strategy that can bring different actors in there. I've talked about this for a long time, but because it's relevant to the way in which I want to go about this job. WHO is not going to be able to deal with the multiplicity of issues that it's asked to deal with simply by behaving as though it is the universal actor and leader that must be left alone to deal with each problem on its own and must somehow strive and struggle in its various offices, the 6 regional offices, its headquarters, and the more than 100 country presences that it's got, trying to do everything as a sort of unique actor in the global system. The issues that we're dealing with in health, the big priority issues, are so multifaceted and involve so many different actors that we need a much more systems approach to dealing with them. And WHO has to be the conductor of the multiple orchestras that are working on these issues, and to do it really skillfully, given that at all times there will be questions about whether the organisation is able to cope with the varied and different interests that inevitably come together when you've got these multi-partner, multi-stakeholder approaches going on. I think there are 4 thrusts of work that need to be prioritised. The first is actually this transformation that we've got in what's happening globally as a result of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, with its 17 goals, 169 targets, and more than 200 indicators. It's not interesting just to see it as goals and to critique it as a set of goals in the way, and to compare it perhaps adversely with the Millennium Development Goals, which were very different. Instead, see it as the plan for the future of the world, people and planet. The only plan that we've got, it's been agreed by all 193 member states, which is remarkable, and more than 50 of them have already integrated the Sustainable Development Goals, their principle of universality, interconnectedness, leaving no one behind, integrated action, and multi-stakeholder working. 50 governments and countries have already integrated this into their national planning, and we're only 10 months into the first year of the 15-year SDG agenda. It's a remarkable revolution and transformation that's underway. It's difficult because it's leading to requiring new ways of thinking, acting, organising, communicating and reporting for everybody who's involved in development. It's no good just staying stuck saying, I'm dealing with a small subset of an issue and behaving as though you can ignore everything else because all that matters is dealing with your own small issue. That doesn't fit in to the spirit of what the countries that agreed after 2.5 years, the SDGs, that they agreed they wanted. And with across this tapestry of the Sustainable Development Agenda, health is a universal outcome. It's everywhere. It's in every single goal. If you're dealing with climate, if you're dealing with ocean life, if you're dealing with inequity, if you're dealing with water sanitation, if you're dealing with war and peace, health is in there. Health is a universal outcome. And so health in all the goals is a really, really important notion. And it changes the way in which we view health when we look at it within the context of the SDGs. Health is also an input. Without good health, it's extremely hard for people to be productive. Without good health, it's extremely hard for women to be able to participate in making sure that there is a greater share and equity for women in development, and girls' empowerment is absolutely impossible without access to sexual and reproductive health. So health is an input, but health is also an outcome. And this is something that I will put very high up in my work in WHO. Secondly, the work on outbreaks and emergencies, starting at the local level, within nations, within communities. The health security, community health security is key. It's incredibly important. And missing early outbreaks or denying that they exist is totally unacceptable. I'm involved in all sorts of aspects of this. In Ebola, we were clear that that was a denial. In avian influenza, we were seeing much denial and fear. In cholera, we've had a denial that unfortunately my own organisation has been involved in. And so putting the capacity to deal with outbreaks and emergencies right at the centre is really important. But using obviously the logic of the international health regulations, using the Global Health Security Agenda, which is absolutely brilliant, but trying to make sure that we get this thinking about the importance of health security and health systems that are capable of preparation, detection and response is so important. There's no other defence mechanism than the health sector. There's no other global body than WHO for working on this. And it was not done well at all in Ebola. And there are other examples of not good performance, but probably the yellow fever outbreak has had some question marks over it, though I don't think we straight away go along with the media argument that that's all WHO's fault. the system for dealing with these outbreaks, the systems for making sure that there are supplies of the necessary diagnostics and vaccines to deal with them, the systems for making sure that there is a strategic approach to research so that we're not always starting from a standing start each time there's a new outbreak, could really be tuned up. And we have a new global health crisis task force that the UN Secretary General has set up, and we're seeing ways in which that is pointing to things going ahead. And then I want to come to my third priority, which is the relationship between the Secretariat of WHO and the member states. This is not a straightforward us and them relationship. Actually, the WHO is intimately rooted into the member states. You can't easily draw a boundary between what is the World Health Organization, what are the member states. And you see that a lot with things like the Global Outbreak Alert and Response Network, which is a network of multiple professionals. We used it heavily during Ebola, which is actually drawn on expertise within the member states. And it leads to very interesting challenges on where power and responsibility lie. But what we have to do is to be extremely clever about coping with the fact that this web, a network of relationships exists, that it does make life quite tricky when you're dealing with issues of global public concern, whilst at the same time respecting the sovereignty of national governments. And within this, there are two words that are key: trust and respect. And to make sure that there is the trust and respect that's desired between the Secretariat and the member states is going to be critical. To get there, were the characteristics of WHO's performance that have got to be always at the top of our minds in the organisation are reliability, consistency, transparency and accountability. We won't get stronger relationships between the member states, and there are very multiple group of organisations with different needs and different interests. We won't get it without those words being put there. Number 4, people-centred health policies and actions. Right? If we go back to the primary healthcare movement when it was started in the 70s and the work that Dr. Mahler did, the one extraordinary and revolutionary thing about that was that it focused on access and empowerment of the individual, and then, when necessary, access to services as needed. One of the greatest inequities in human development is the inequity in access to care when people are sick. And the more we look at what are the causes of impoverishment, catastrophic costs and consequences of ill health or death due to illness, particularly in poor communities, is supremely important. And yet at the same time, so often when analyses are done of health services, the focus is on provision and not on access. It does not look at the extent to which people can access, particularly in fragile situations in emergencies, and particularly for people living in the bottom quintile economically, or people who belong to ethnic groups that are not popular with national authorities, or people who are disabled, or people who've got other aspects that make it difficult, and especially children and women. Although there is a lot of emphasis in international development on the interests of children and the interests of women, we still all the time, particularly I see this through the work I do in the Every Woman, Every Child initiative, find that women are marginalised, and we've seen it particularly in the recent mass migrations and refugee situations. They're not only marginalised in terms of access to healthcare, they're marginalised in terms of basic things like whether or not they access what's required for their handling their menstrual health, for handling pregnancy, for access to abortions and other things that they need. And there are so many other really difficult issues around women's care in emergencies or in poverty or in disability that have to be put at the centre. So access, everyone, everywhere, trying to look at the really challenging issues of escalating costs of delivering healthcare, particularly in ageing populations, the challenge of women and girls having access, and then within all this, I see continuing difficulties related to the self-respect and opportunities for health professionals, but particularly those working as care providers at the local level, community care providers. People are often volunteers or very low paid who do an awful lot of care provision, usually women, at community level, and then nurses and midwives. The WHO has, I believe at the moment, 1 midwife on its staff, and I think perhaps 2 or 3 people who are working as nurses. And one of the things I'd really like to do is just focus on what we can do as an organisation to slightly redistribute the attention so that we focus on the people who really do deliver health outcomes. All this involves continuous focus on inclusion and engagement, particularly at community level. Every time we analyse what's happening in the different health issues we're dealing with, we find that we suck it back to being a professional issue, we white coat it, and that has been a problem in every issue I've dealt with. And it all involves partnering. Partnering's not easy. Creating space for those with less power in partnerships is really hard work. They can get squeezed out. And yet if we don't do that, we don't get it right. So I've got a campaign. It's at the moment building up. I've got good support from Britain. They're not quite sure yet what it will be in terms of resources. And we will be able to make sure that we move forward. But as we move ahead, we are seeing there are going to be some really tough problems that have got to be addressed in the organisation. There are real challenges with the way WHO is financed. We're not going to be able to deal with those overnight. We have to look very hard at trying not to be formulaic on finance, but instead trying to be opportunistic, because simply being formulaic is not worked, and we got some challenges in some of the formulae there. We need to continue to look for the right kind of people to make sure that, as well as having expertise in their professional area, they have the skills needed for working in the way that I've just described. I think that governance will continue to be a talking point. In the food sector, new governance arrangements have been established where you've got governments, civil society, business, and science actually participating in a structured way in the governance. It's still not working. It's not right. But in WHO, the tension between the different groups of actors who would like to have a role in governance and the way in which that plays out is still not resolved. I still think that we have to make sure that member states, as duty bearers, are right at the centre of the governance process. But I do think other stakeholders need to have space in there. And then lastly, if you're working on health, you have to be prepared for all sorts of novel challenges. They might be toxins, they might be environmental transformations, they might be pathogens, they could be viral, they could be bacterial, protozoal. No, you can't ever be complacent. So the last thing that I would say is that I very much want to be sure that as an organisation, we never get complacent, because you don't know what's coming around the corner. And to be able to deal with surprises really does matter. Sorry if I went on slightly longer than I meant, but I hope that gives you at least some feeling of the way in which I propose to do this. And I want to stress to you in just last sentence, you know, the Director General's role is not just to be a manager like the CEO of a large company. Because WHO is not just the people who go around with WHO in their email addresses. WHO actually is a much bigger force for good, for health, for well-being than what happens inside the organisation, because its influence ripples to the tens of thousands of organisations that are in some way or other either intellectually or emotionally or operationally linked to it. And so I think it's really important that whoever is the Director General of WHO will be ready to see themselves as having an influence and a responsibility that is beyond what's in the budget or beyond the staff that report. It's a bigger responsibility. I don't want to over-egg it, but I think it's important, and that's why I wanted to present a little bit about me and about the way in which I approach it, because I think that's important to you.
Thank you so much. Before we open it up, I just want to ask one question and follow up. Thank you for outlining your 4 key priorities so well. Maybe you could speak a little bit to, particularly around the SDGs, what you see as the major obstacles to achieving those and how you would address those in your tenure.
Now, thank you very much, Sarah. The difficulty on that one, obviously, is that I'm, in a way, identified with the SDGs in the UN, so I'm dealing with 65 different UN cost centres on the SDGs right now, of which WHO is one. And it really is interesting to then move from my rather broad stuff that I'm doing right now to the very specific WHO. So I want to pick on three things. One, the universality of the SDGs. Within our UN system, most of our organisations are very much focused on either least developed or developing countries, rather less on middle-income countries and very, very little on the wealthy countries. And that's natural because our organisations are either dealing with peace and security, and we're dealing with an awful lot of wars or potential wars in poor countries, or we're dealing with human rights, and the focus is rather more on the poorer part of the world than the richer part of the world. You might think that's wrong, but that's how it is. And then thirdly, we're dealing with development, and development has, up until the SDGs came into force, been seen as an issue for poor countries. But with the SDGs, we're actually really shifting the concept. Development is a universal challenge. On climate change, some of the richer nations have got further to travel than some of the poorer nations as they decarbonise their economies. So I've been looking very hard at which parts of our UN system are truly universal. And what other parts? Answer the specialised agencies. The Food and Agriculture Organization, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the International Telecommunications Union, the World Maritime Organization, World Meteorological Organization, and the World Health Organization. And there are others as well. We've got 22. But I want to stress that these specialised agencies are going to be key to ensuring that this plan for the future gets properly implemented. Firstly, they are universal in their mandate. Secondly, they are required to set standards for the world. They're negotiated standards, but they've got to be based on technical analysis, and that's a very, very important part of looking at the future. Thirdly, they have a responsibility for measurement and for looking at where we're going. And so as we look at the particularly goal 3, we see that it really is important to have good matrices. So I think that WHO will have a major role in helping us with the standards side and the measurement side, and the specialised agencies are important in that respect. So the first thing I wanted to stress is that we need the specialised agencies to be really focused on the SDGs, and we need to make sure their governing bodies do that as well. And I've been crusading around trying to do that. Secondly, on the SDGs, tough part is, are we going to take the equality goal seriously or not? If you ask me what is the major threat to whether we're going to have a world that's fit for our grandchildren's grandchildren, I still think it's either inequity in terms of whether or not people get what they need, or inequality in terms of whether or not resources are fairly shared. I'm extremely worried that when we look at the increase in the wealth of the world that's happened over the last 20 years, so much of that is concentrated in the top less than 1% of the people in the world, the extremely wealthy. And so redistribution for me becomes a major issue. And without that, dealing with some of the ongoing difficulties is hard, and it applies in all nations, the skewing and capture of wealth. And thirdly, the issue of climate change. We've got the agreement, but will there be enough pressure on the nations that are being very expensive in terms of carbon use, in terms of the dirtiness of their energy systems, or the dirtiness of their transport systems or infrastructures, or urban development? Is there going to be enough pressure to truly decarbonise at the speed that's necessary? China will set an example. I just spent a lot of time this year in China, mostly because I want to learn from what they're doing, because I think it's relevant to other countries. But I do worry. We work very closely with the Canadians, a very go-ahead government that was ready to ratify COP21 months ago. But Prime Minister Trudeau was saying to us, we've got to go through the political process with our provinces. The provinces have got to come on board. So taking forward some of these tricky SDGs is an intensely political process. And I worry whether or not there will be the energy to carry through. I'm a lot happier about it now, particularly having worked a lot with the Saudis this year than I was, and I'm reasonably positive, but that's a problem. So number one, can we be truly universal, and can we use our instruments to do that? Number two, can we at least perceive that there's some hope for dealing with the inequities that are capturing so much of resources and keeping them in the hands of the rich, even in some of the poor countries? And thirdly, are we going to be able to collectively move quickly enough on decarbonising and trying to make certain that we do stick to 2 degrees? Because the consequences of climate change, we see them already. There was a rotten El Nino that's just finished. Fortunately, it looks as though the chances of a La Nina are a bit lower. But the consequences of that El Nino, which was exacerbated, we believe, by climate change, have been very, very bad. And there's just going to be more and more of these. And those of you who've been working with the Bangladeshis or others dealing with salination or have been working in the Sahel just see it and feel it, and it's difficult.
Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and open it up to questions. If you can just remember to use your mic and introduce yourself and your organization.
Yes, good morning. I'm Larry Gostin. I'm the faculty director of the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law at Georgetown University and the head of the WHO Collaborating Center on Public Health Law and Human Rights. David, you're enormously accomplished, and you've done so much for the world. I just wanted to begin by saying, expressing my admiration. Your agenda is very robust. Much of it depends on political leadership, which I think you can demonstrate, but also financing, which is what you ended with your talk. Right now, even the new WHO emergency outbreak program is well underfunded for its startup costs. The emergency contingency fund is underfunded. We're pivoting toward a new era of security. What will that do for funding for NCDs, for injuries, for mental health, universal health coverage, all of the really critical things that WHO does? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on innovative financing, because I think you're quite right. We're not going to get there by the traditional formula of assessed dues. That's clear from the last decade to 2 decades. So we need to think of new funding models, be creative, and I'd love to hear your ideas, particularly given your UN experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larry. I mean, if I was Philippe Douste-Blazy, I would have a pretty good answer to that question. And I think that some of the innovations that he's brought in are really important and have a lot of currency, the taxation on various activities and so on. So I want to straight away say that I think novel forms of levy will be important, but I don't think they will produce significantly large amounts of money. I think they will produce useful extra pieces that can help, as UNITAID has done. So is there an area, an avenue where much bigger financing can come from, particularly for dealing with global goods? I went to Montreal to the Global Fund replenishment, and I was watching the way in which the different groups involved, from the foundations like Gates through to the private sector, a bit smaller, but quite a lot smaller, but still significant, and then the government. And I was thinking, how come they can get 12.9 billion plus when they were quite depressed about the prospects three months ago, and yet WHO's got whatever it is, 12 or so out of the 100 million that it wants for emergency program. After all, yes, HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria are serious problems, but in the view of many heads of state and government, the kind of issues we were dealing with Ebola and yellow fever and SARS and possible pandemic influenza are even bigger. And we raised, as you know, collectively much more than $3.5 billion for Ebola. So I am increasingly convinced that there is public money available, Larry. I'm not saying that we therefore have got to try to compete and take away from really well organized and run operations like the Global Fund. I just think that having listened to the many ministers that I knew who were present in Montreal, that they have a vision that the Global Fund offers not just value for money, but also something that they can go back to their constituents when they're trying to get money, special money out of their ministers of finance, and their constituents will not only say yes, they'll even say things like put in more. So it's a case of, I think, systematically building up confidence in not just the WHO as an institution, but what the WHO stands for, a bit like what I was getting at the end. And I think it's possible. I've certainly done it myself. I haven't done it on the scale that Mark Dyball and the Global Fund have done it, but we did manage to shift the interest in nutrition and in some aspects of small-scale agriculture as an investable proposition. And I've seen also in the Ebola finance a real interest in being part of that, and those who are involved being able to see the results. So I'm writing down, certainly in my own notebook and I've got etched into my brain, that I believe that given 5 years, we can re-establish the sense that investing, not so much in WHO as an institution, but investing in the issues that WHO stands for example, the capacity to make certain that we have health security that is viable at local level as well as global level, investing in the health of women, children, adolescent girls, that we can make these more attractive propositions for public finance. Then I come to private money. When I think hard about who needs the norms of WHO in the health sector, particularly when it comes to delivery of services to older populations, to delivery of services for chronic ill health, there is an enormous benefit that the private sector gets out of what WHO does, particularly in terms of its regulatory work. And I know that there is an anxiety about taking money from business, and I know why that anxiety is there. And you and David Fidler and others have been very clear on how dangerous it is. But I'd like to almost to put it back to you. Are there not more legitimate reasons for us to be saying that business should actually be putting more money into the standard-setting organizations? The businesses that market their products as delivering good health, should we not be expecting some kind of levy to the organization whose job it is to decide what does deliver good health? I haven't an answer, but I don't think the current situation is right when we've got this very large set of industries that are active in and around the care sector, in and around personal health, that somehow none of that money is finding its way to WHO. I haven't got an answer. But I am looking at it very, very hard, because it's not, WHO regular budget is not suddenly going to get a 50% increase from where it is now. We know that, so we have to look at other means. So in summary, I think the public money for global goods is still possible, and I think that we have to market not just what the organization itself, but what it stands for, recognizing the success that's been happening here in United States, particularly, but it should be possible in other countries as well. Secondly, I do think that innovative finance using taxation on transactions has a role, and want to go on looking at that and learning from the experience there's been. And then I think there's more private money that ought to be taken, but I haven't worked out yet how to do it. And it would be, if I was in the job, that would be one of the first things I'd ask some people to come along and do. And I'd bring in the people who are most worried about private money, right in at the beginning, saying you've got to be there, because then they can help work it out. And in a way, I'd like to ask you what your ideas are, because I know you think about this an awful lot.
I think maybe we'll take some more questions since we've got about 15, 20 minutes left. Go ahead here, and then we'll take them back.
Thank you, David. Very interesting. You talked about your concept of WHO as not just the people who have a WHO.int email address, but the broader vision of it. And I think many of us would agree with that. But at the same time, one of the difficulties that the leader of WHO has, unlike Anthony Lake at UNICEF and others, is that you have independently elected regional directors. And that has come up in some of the analyses and recommendations emanating from the WHO response to Ebola. How do you see yourself making this one WHO as opposed to different fiefdoms around the world at the regional level?
So thank you very much indeed. First of all, having strong regional offices that are deeply rooted in their regional constituencies is an incredible plus for any organization in today's world. The energy at regional level that we are seeing from our position in the UN is really important. And to have regional political bodies like the European Union or ASEAN is vital, but also having well-organized and cost-effective and transparent and accountable institutions that serve regional interests is desirable as well. So that said, we then move on to some of the challenges of having regional entities that are sometimes perceived to be able to be independent of the stewardship of the center of WHO. Firstly, I've worked, as you know, in that setting for years. I had a key role as the convener of one of the more significant groups in WHO that looks after the different regional organizations. It is possible, and in fact, we've shown it can be successful, to bring the regions together in terms of financing, in terms of personnel, in terms of performance benchmarks, and in terms of program behavior. And we were able to do that when I was there on a number of different issues, including malaria and environmental health. And I will very much seek to do more of that when I'm Director General. It's a little more difficult in one specific area, Ambassador, and that is when judgments have to be made on particularly delicate issues. For example, when the organization needs to, as Sarah said in her introduction, speak truth to power and confront a national leader over a problem in one country which may have impacts on other countries. And that's been, I think, quite well analyzed and documented, both in the analyses of Ebola and actually other outbreaks that have been undertaken over the last few years. And secondly, we looked into it in some detail in the advisory group that I chaired on WHO reform. I do believe that as I look at what happened as a result of that work, that we've moved a lot closer to an identification of where responsibility lies for different kinds of global threat as a device to try to reduce the extent to which the perceived closeness of people in different parts of the organization to national governments, the ways in which that can impinge on the ability of the organization as a whole to address and sometimes be quite tough with national leaders. The difficulty is perceived to be greatest for the WHO country representative, whose presence in a country is highly dependent on the relationship between that person's office and the national government. So it's never easy. We have the same in the UN, and often we are forced to back our own staff at country level, and they may end up then being invited to leave, and we may actually have a difficulty with the country. We have that quite a lot, Ambassador, in quite a lot of cases. So it's not an unusual thing, even in other parts of the UN. So the challenge faced by the countries has to be understood. It's not common, but it's there. And then, in a slightly less acute way, there's maybe a challenge faced by the regional offices. And so, I'm saying when, I'm stopping saying if. When I'm Director General, we will be explicit about this in the organisation. We will understand it. We will look at individual cases in the Global Policy Group, which is the group of Director General and Regional Directors, and we will analyse them together. Because the style of management that I will introduce there is one of the one WHO. We are a single organisation. We're not 7 organisations. And we will deal with these issues together. And we will develop an ability to deal with them. And there will always be a recognition that there's no simple answer to these challenges. It's not ever there is a right answer, there's a wrong answer. There are always judgment calls. And we will do those judgment calls together. But we will recognise that the buck finally stops with the Director General. And so if there is an uncertainty, then it will be the Director General who makes that decision. Now that came through. I mean, the discussions we had when the results of our advisory group were presented to the Executive Board meeting around the 24th of January this year were quite tough. And I think that both our characterisation of the issue in our report was a bit bald, and the way in which some different member states reacted to it was also perhaps not seeing the nuance in our thinking. But what's happened in the subsequent period up until May, I believe, has led to a much greater understanding of how this needs to be addressed, and I believe we're in a better place. Now I have to test that, but this is my view. And so I finally say, please let's recognise that on none of these judgment calls is there an absolute correct answer. You only find out what the correct answer is retrospectively. Then, of course, you can kick yourself and say, we should have done X and not Y. But so often, when you're in the thick of it, that's not so clear. And it is just a matter of judgment rather than a right or wrong. And that's why what I want to be able to do is to make sure that we deal with these judgment issues as a collective rather than just see it as kind of trying to be hardline. And when I worked with Dr. Brundtland, we used to see very clearly, she taught me this, I mean, and taught everybody this, that however strongly you might feel, in this kind of organisation, you just cannot rule by diktat. It doesn't work. Talk to you some more about it. I mean, it's a never-ending discussion.
All right, thank you. In the back.
Jim Sherry, Director of the Center for Immigrant, Refugee, and Global Health at the City University of New York. David, let me just endorse everything Larry said about of your distinguished and continuing career in global health. 2 related questions. One a campaign question, as I guess you would expect, and the other an institutional.
But Jim, remember I'm deaf.
Yes.
I said okay. I'm in good health, but the one thing, I had half this ear blown off in Baghdad.
And I'm not used to being asked to speak louder, so this works well. And I'm asking you, because you very rarely do speak quietly. So two related questions. The first, campaign related. You know, there was a time, as quaint as it may seem now, where gentle persons agreed that the Perm 5 wouldn't put forth candidates for the specialized agencies. Part of the thinking, and maybe the issue here, the political issue is, to what extent do the agencies look for the best intellect or the best person available in the world, or do they look for the best person in rotation, in some kind of anticipated rotation? And so we're seeing this play out, of course, with the African Union trying to consolidate around a position. And so I'm just interested in how you're going to articulate that, or what's the positive way to articulate that, because there'll be that sense of expectation and that sense of leaving out, and then not to mention your Brexit implications with a French and a U.S. or a UK candidate. So that's one question. But that relates to the second on institutional positioning. So and how you would in this world get the kind of the posturing correct for WHO, getting that Goldilocks principle right, where it is it's not so strong. Appreciating that there are some superpowers that either don't understand or appreciate or value multilateralism. How are you going to strike the balance between having a WHO that is strong enough to be relevant, faced with major operational or political challenges, but not so strong where it is going to be competing with the major operational and political powers on particular issues?
The first question's, I think, easier. The second question is, in a way, the heart of the matter. The process of election was changed before this one, so that there would be an initial shortlisting of 5 done electronically, then a shortlisting of 3 at the Executive Board, and then the election of 1 at the Assembly. Previously, it was all done, as I think you all know, at the Executive Board. There was a strong feeling among governments, not all governments, but certainly at least 20 that I was in contact with during the summer of this year, that the field just could be bigger than the 3 that were out and public for several months. And I personally agree with that. I think the electorate in this particular competition need a broad field, and a diverse field, a field that includes people who are primarily political and have got a strong political pedigree, and people who are primarily technical or operational and have got a track record in that area. Because it's not immediately clear to anybody what is the best kind of individual for this specialised agency. And indeed, it applies to all our specialised agencies. If you were to do a study of the heads of our specialised agencies, you would see a big mix. Politicians, technicians with history of working in their own national governments, and technicians like me with a history of working internationally. And I don't think that there is a right answer, but I do think there ought to be a spread. And I think that behind my coming into this, certainly from my perspective, and I think pretty strongly from the British perspective, was just let's widen the field. And I believe that that's important. There is no rotation, and I think that that must be understood. It's absolutely not an organisation where there is an assumption of rotation, and so it's reasonable to have candidates from all over. There are many who are surprised that it ended up with 4 Europeans after having had 1 European for rather a long time. I can't really comment on that. I think certainly we did not know that others were coming in. I did not know who else, that 2 other candidates were there until the whole thing was announced. I don't want to talk about links to Brexit because that's not inside my sphere of understanding or influence, and it would not be helpful, I think. Now, the nature of the relationship between multilateral organizations that have been created to function on behalf of global goods and the interests of individual nations, powerful and less powerful, who are seeking to often exercise power through the way in which they interact with the multilateral system, is hugely challenging. And to a degree, that was what lay behind the original idea of having the elected regional directors, as I think many people here understand. I mean, there has been a lot said in the analyses of WHO's work about the way in which the Director General needs to behave. There's been a lot said about the way in which the institution needs to behave. And then there's been a lot of questions about whether or not the institution's behaviour is somewhat influenced by particularly the pattern of voluntary funding. And all these issues are things that I believe are appropriate for analysis. And I think the Director General needs to be able to have space for them to be properly discussed. I think the financing dialogue that will take place on the 31st of October is one of the examples of an effort to do this. But no quick answer to that, Jim, because I think what you've said reflects a dialectic that needs to be regularly worked on. My bias is towards the organisation having enough strength and credibility and capability and consistency to be able to earn the respect and trust of all nations, and to demonstrate that, and therefore also to be able to get out of the particular difficulty it's in on funding. And that's certainly the direction I'd want to go in. I don't think it's going to be immediate, and that will be my, the thing that I will say to myself as I wake up every morning. It will be about those attributes that I mentioned in the beginning, that I've written in my note that you've got in front of you, because without that, it will be very hard to establish the position that I think the world needs of WHO right now.
Thank you. I think we've raised a number of very interesting and compelling issues today, and we could probably spend quite a bit more time talking.
An MSc course on it.
Absolutely.
University.
Unfortunately, we need to call an end to today's session, but thank you so much to Dr. Nabarro for being here and presenting his key priorities for his candidacy. I'd like to also thank Chris Millard from our team for pulling this event together, and hope to see you here at another point in time with one of the other candidates for Director General. Thank you.
Could I also thank Sarah? Could I thank Sarah? Could I thank Steve, who's not here? Could I thank Chris and colleagues in CSIS, all of you for coming along? And don't hesitate, whatever happens on this election, to keep the conversation going. And my email address is on the piece of paper in front of you. Love to talk some more. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.